welcome to today's webinar. Today we are covering the changes in revision 2.4 of the R2v3 Code of Practices. My name is Austin Matthews and I am the EHS Program Manager at PJR. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are muted for today's webinar. They will remain muted for the entirety of the webinar duration. If you have any questions, please use the question tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. I will save the questions for the end of the presentation, but feel free to type them at any point during the webinar and I will get to them at the end. I will answer them to the best of my ability. And if I don't know the answer, I'm happy to work on getting that for you and circle back around. Today's webinar is being recorded to be reviewed or reassessed in the future. So a copy of the slides as well as a recording of today's webinar will be made available on PJR's website sometime after the presentation is complete. If you have any inquiries or you'd like to reach out to inquire about certification, please contact PJR at pjr.com. And the last slide of the presentation will contain my contact information if you have a technical question or a concern of a more technical nature. The agenda for today's webinar includes a brief introduction of the Code of Practices document, when it was published, what the implementation deadlines look like for the changes in revision 2.4. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time today covering those key changes found within the revisions compared to version 2.3 of the Code of Practices. So you know kind of what's new, what's coming, what's changing, and how it can impact an R2 facility. As I mentioned, we'll save questions for the end of the presentation, but you can type them into the question tab or the question field at any point during the webinar. Version 2.4 of the Code of Practices was published on February 18th of this year. Revised copies are already available on CERI's website, of course. They became available February 18th. You can download the current version of the standard, the rec, as well as the Code of Practices at no cost at any time on CERI's website. There's a document library page. The page does require you to sign an agreement with CERI before accessing those downloads, but again, they're available at no cost. The standard and the rec were previously updated, and the Code of Practices, as I mentioned, was revised on February 18th. So that was the publication date of version 2.4, but that is not the same as an implementation date. So as far as implementation goes for the revised Code of Practices, certification bodies, CBs, like Perry Johnson registrars, who conduct the audits and issue the certificates, we have an implementation period. We have a deadline by which we need to implement the new version of the Code of Practices and all of the revised requirements within it. The deadline for implementing the changes is May 18th, 2025. CERI is giving CBs 90 days to implement the changes. There is one exception to that deadline. There is a requirement that CERI is giving CBs longer to implement for existing clients. And we'll talk about this in more detail when we get to the relevant slide. But section 8.8.1 of version 2.4 of the Code of Practices allows we're getting an extension or a further out implementation deadline for section 8.1.1 for existing clients. New clients, we have to implement this by May 18th, 2025 with all of the other code of practice changes. But for existing clients, we do have until January 1st, 2026 to meet the changes in 8.1.1. And that change specifically relates to the annual deadline for audits. There used to be verbiage about having the first audit, the first annual surveillance audit following a stage 2 within 12 months, and then allowing the second surveillance audit to go within 15 months of the first annual surveillance, and so on. The new requirement will be that there's essentially an anniversary deadline every year based on the stage 2 or the recertification audit's decision date. That differs from the audit date. It relates to the date that a certificate decision was made, and every year that it'll be due within 12 months of that date. So this is something that we'll speak more about when we get to that slide. All of the requirements within the Code of Practices that are changing, with the exception of section 8.1.1 for existing clients, will need to be implemented by May 18th, 2025. And for existing clients, 8.1.1, we have until January 1st of next year to adjust our clients' audit schedules to meet this requirement. Generally speaking, the slides we are reviewing today go in order from the beginning of the Code of Practices to the end of the Code of Practices as far as the changes are concerned. However, there are a few instances where I went out of order to group similar changes together in a more cohesive manner. So generally speaking, we're going from top to bottom from the Code of Practices, focusing only on the changes, the key revisions. If it was something minor like a terminology change that doesn't affect the process or the intent of a requirement isn't changing at all, I did not include it in this webinar. I really wanted to focus on the more significant changes since there are so many. The first key change we're going to talk about is notifying Siri of changes for facilities. We have a deadline as a CB, as a certification body. We're required to report changes to Siri within a certain number of days, specifically 7 days. Facility changes can include a wide variety of things, including changes to location, like a facility move, a name change, which might mean a formal change of the entity name. It could also mean the addition of a DBA or a second entity name that needs to be included in certification. So that's a broad category of name changes. And certification structure is another one. So when we're talking about certification structure, we're talking about the scheme. Are we a single facility? Are we a campus scheme? Are we shared facility? Are we a common parent, or are we a group? So any changes to the scheme or the cert structure also needs to be reported. There's a whole list of things that need to be reported to Siri, but the impact of this change means that we need our clients to be timely in their communication of the changes as well, so that we can turn around and inform Siri. We are required to audit these changes as a CB. We're required to verify the changes within 60 days of the effective date of the change. This is a new deadline. This is a change to the process in the Code of Practices. Needing to conduct these audits within 60 days of the effective date of the change means that, again, it's really important for our clients, for our certified companies, to be communicative and prompt in their communication so that we can meet this deadline. The effective date of the change is not the date that our clients notify us. It's the date where they registered that name change, for example, or the date that they stopped fulfilling their scope of certification at their existing location to facilitate a move. Failure to meet the 60-day deadline to have the audit will result in suspension of the R2 certification. So it's a significant ramification. It's not withdrawn. Suspension can be lifted within a specific amount of time if the necessary actions are taken, but with timely communication and timely scheduling of the verification audit, we can potentially avoid that suspension altogether. So this is a significant change for our clients. In instances of facility moves under version 2.3, suspension was unavoidable. So this gives us an opportunity to schedule the audits quickly, to react quickly, and potentially avoid suspension. Conversely, name changes and changes to certification structure didn't previously have a deadline, nor were they commonly resulting in suspensions. Now we have the 60-day deadline, and the ramification to not meeting it will include suspension. So again, we're talking about changes such as changes to location or facility moves, changes to names, and changes to certification structure. There's also a requirement to issue revised certificates reflective of those changes, whatever they may be, within 6 months of that effective change date. So again, we're talking not about the date that PJR was notified, but actually the date, the effective date of the change, the facility move, the name registration, whatever the case may be. So if we have a deadline of issuing the revised certificates within 6 months of that change date, I wanted to remind everyone that that includes not just having the audit within those 6 months, but also closing any NCRs that might have been identified during the audit, as well as the technical review of the package that needs to take place. The Code of Practice does require that every audit package is technically reviewed by the certification body, so that's not a step that we can skip. Again, there are ramifications for not meeting the deadlines. If the certificate is suspended and a revised certificate isn't issued within 6 months, the certificate must be withdrawn. Even if it isn't suspended and the audit takes place within the 60-day deadline, but we're unable to issue a revised certificate within 6 months of the change, the certificate still needs to be withdrawn. So we do need to audit these in a timely manner. We need to resolve any nonconformities related to the audit and the change in a timely manner, so that the certificate has a higher chance of maintaining its status and not being withdrawn. It's possible to do these change verification audits as standalone audits or in conjunction with an annual audit. However, if it's conducted in conjunction with an annual audit, time needs to be added to the existing audit duration to verify the changes. And it would only be feasible to audit it in conjunction with the annual audit if we are able to do that within the 60 days of the effective date of the change, or if we're accepting a suspension, but the timing of the annual audit still allows the possibility of issuing that certificate within the 6-month deadline. So these are all things to take into consideration when you're planning changes and ensuring that you're reporting the changes in a timely manner to the certification body. As a friendly reminder, the prerequisite quality, environmental, health, and safety certificates that are required for R2 eligibility, whether they're held with the same CB or a different CB, need to also reflect those changes to avoid NCRs during the change audit. For example, if we're doing a facility move verification audit and the old address is still listed on the Rios certificate and held with a different CB, that would result in an NCR that needs to be resolved before the R2 certificate could be revised to show that new address. This is a pretty significant change. Moving on to the next key change. R2 facility personnel are required to be the primary participants in R2 audits. Conversely, consultants are not permitted to act on behalf of the R2 facility or influence the audit, as this would constitute a conflict of interest. This can be found in section 3.6.2 of the Code of Practices. And then we find the definition for the consultant in the terms and definitions table. The Code of Practice defines consultant as any professional that assists the organization in implementation, management, and oversight of requirements. A consultant can be a contractor or an employee of the candidate facility or R2 certified facility. The bottom bullet point indicates that the name and company name of the consultant or consultants is required to be captured in a couple of places, including our contract review activities and the audit report for a stage 1, a stage 2, a surveillance, or a recertification audit. We will have to capture in any of those audits who the consultant is and what company they work for. It won't matter whether the consultant is present during the audit or not. Will still be required by the changes in the Code of Practices to capture this information. So this is covering a number of topics, and the bottom bullet point is citing a couple of sections in the Code of Practice, section 4.1.10 and section 7.10's table 7. What this means is that the R2 facility needs to be facilitating the audit. It shouldn't be managed by the consultant. It needs to be managed by the R2 facility personnel. They need to be the primary participants. If a consultant is acting on behalf of the R2 facility or influencing the audit, it may not be considered objective. It can be a conflict of interest. There are also a number of ways in which a consultant can be utilized. They could be responsible for managing the documents. They could come in a couple of times a year and do the internal audits and or the compliance audits, perhaps the data verification activities. There's a number of ways in which consultants might be utilized. So it's also possible that when we capture a consultant's name and company, that there could be more than one. So we may need to understand their role within the organization better to be able to populate those fields adequately. Let's see. Another revision in the Code of Practices is a requirement to consult SERI in instances where a candidate facility, someone who's pursuing initial certification, or a company that's pursuing initial certification, doesn't exactly fit the certification structure, definitions, or details outlined in Table 3 of the Code of Practices. Sometimes the scheme descriptions aren't a perfect fit, and perhaps we need to consult SERI as far as what they would prefer the CB categorize a client as, or if there's an opportunity to perhaps deviate from some of those descriptions a little bit, or combine some factors. Lately, for example, we've seen a couple instances of a campus certification structure or scheme, meaning we have multiple locations that are processing material jointly that also perhaps feature more than one entity name, which would be more of a common parent situation. So while the certificate is required to reflect campus because of the multiple locations, there is an understanding that common parent is also factoring in, at least to an extent, because there's more than one entity name. That's just one example I could think of off the top of my head when I was working on these slides, but there could very well be others. And since CIRI is also working on reviewing the standard in preparation for any revisions after it's been out for 5 years, this is an area where they want to be kept in the loop. They want to be consulted because perhaps those descriptions or this approach will be part of what is revised in the next iteration. Another revision in the Code of Practice relates to the CIRI license agreement, which previously was not required to be demonstrated until stage 1 audits took place. Now, the CIRI license agreement will be required prior to stage 1 by the contract review phase. PJR calls the contract review activity a contract validation, so it's a very similar name. But when we're conducting the contract validation, if the candidate facility doesn't already have a CIRI license agreement, they'll be unable to pass that step. They won't be approved to proceed to stage 1 until a license agreement has been obtained. There might be some instances where CIRI is issuing probationary licenses and going through this process and requiring the license be presented during the contract validation. The certification body can become aware of any additional stipulations or requirements that the candidate facility may be subject to. For example, a probationary license that might require us to structure our audits differently. So prior to receiving approval to proceed to stage 1 from the contract validation phase, a license agreement will be required to be demonstrated. The changes on this slide can be found in section 4.1.4 of the Code of Practices. I touched on the QEHS, or Quality Environmental Health and Safety prerequisite certificates, a little bit before, but there's changes in the verbiage, strengthening of the requirements that were already there in version 2.4 of the Code of Practices. So some examples of that are found in section 4.1.5, as well as 7.4.1 of the Code of Practices. The QEHS prerequisite certificates must contain names, addresses, and scopes that match and support, without contradicting, the R2 certificate's contents. Most often, our R2 clients meet the QEHS prerequisite requirements through either ISO 14001 and 45001, as well as ISO 9001 if they have applicable appendices or process requirements that require a QMS certification. Or if they don't go the ISO route, the majority of our clients will utilize RIOS 2016 certification, which is a quality environmental health and safety standard. The scope-specific verbiage is also a requirement of the Code of Practices. And again, the verbiage in the Code of Practices has been revised to make this intention, this requirement, really clear. It was already the intent, and there was already verbiage about this in 2.3, but it's been elaborated upon in 2.4. Scope-specific verbiage might include something like the term brokering on a QMS certificate, a quality management system certificate, for R2 clients who are certified to Appendix F. Another example might be the verbiage testing or repairing or refurbishing for R2 clients who are certified to Appendix C, depending on what specifically they're doing within Appendix C. The types of materials processed according to the scope also need to be in agreement. So it wouldn't be acceptable for a QMS scope to list the testing of mobile phones if the R2 certificate, lists the testing of mobile phones, laptops, and tablets. So they need to be in agreement, they need to correlate, and we can't have any contradictions. The Code of Practice version 2.4 even goes on to require a major NCR be issued in instances where the QEHS certificates are found to be invalid. And this invalid status specifically can include not only a suspension or an expiration of the certificates themselves, but also the validity, the accuracy of the names, the addresses, and or the scopes. This next bullet point is not a change to the intention. This was already required, although I'm not sure whether all of our clients are aware of this or not, but the verbiage has been added to the Code of Practice or revised. This is section 7.4.2. Non-integrated audit time is utilized for affected appendices in instances where the QEHS certificates are held by a CB that is different from the CB certifying the facility to R2v3, and or in instances where the quality, environmental, health, and safety audits are not conducted at the same time as the R2 audit. So there are a couple of situations here or scenarios covered by this one bullet point. If you have your R2 certificate with PJR and you have your RIOS certificate with a different CB, the R2 duration for affected appendices would be calculated using the higher non-integrated audit time. That's required by the Code of Practice. We don't hold both certificates. There are things that we'll be covering that the RIOS audit would also cover, and instead of being able to audit them at once and save some time, we need to audit them separately, meaning the non-integrated time needs to be utilized. You could also hold your certificates with the same CB, but schedule the audits separately, in which case the non-integrated audit time will also be required to be used. One example might be that your ISO and R2 certifications are asynchronous and you have the audits at different times of the year. Another example might be that the R2 audit is required to be on site, perhaps because of the audit type. Maybe it's a recertification audit, but the ISO QEHS audit is allowed to be virtual. So you're not conducting those audits truly in an integrated manner. Non-integrated audit time for affected appendices, such as Appendix C, D, and F. I'm trying to think if I got them all. E. There are a couple appendices affected by the integration, and the non-integrated audit time is slightly higher than the integrated audit duration. And that is found in, I think I forgot to reference this in my notes. I apologize. The integrated audit time and the non-integrated audit time is part of the audit duration tables in the Code of Practices. I failed to reference the section number or the table number. I'm pretty sure it's several tables found in 5. I can check that and add it to the slides before they're uploaded to PJR's website so that the reference will be found in the slides if you want to check back later. Moving on to the next bullet point, version 2.4 of the Code of Practices requires a major NCR be issued in instances where the quality, environmental, health, and safety certificates are invalid. I did address this at the bottom of the previous slide from the perspective of the scope statements and the names and the importance of having those be matching, but this is found throughout the Code of Practice in a couple of locations, excuse me, really emphasizing the need to keep these certificates valid. They need to be accredited. They need to have an appropriate scope statement that matches the R2 certification The names and addresses need to match. And of course, they need to be kept current. If they're suspended or they lapse, that affects the R2 certification as well. This bullet point doesn't include this verbiage, but in addition to requiring a major NCR, there are also instances where the R2 certificate could be suspended or even withdrawn as a result of the lapse or loss of accreditation or something along those lines for those prerequisite certificates. So it isn't necessarily stopping at a major NCR. Depending on the situation, the R2 certificate could also be negatively impacted. And certainly, if the major NCR isn't resolved by the deadlines called out within the Code of Practice, that could also result in suspension or withdrawal of R2 certification. Copies of the QEHS certificates as prerequisites to R2 certification are now going to be required to be submitted with each annual R2 audit package. This has been added to the Code of Practices as well. So not only will we be validating the certificates with every audit, we'll also be uploading copies of the certificates themselves with each audit package, regardless of whether PJR holds the certificates or the certificates are held by another CB. This is a requirement from CIRI to ensure that copies of the certificates are uploaded with every package. It would be helpful for R2 facilities to ensure they have the most current version of their certificates accessible during their audits to help facilitate this requirement. Taking it a step further, version 2.4 of the Code of Practice also has a new requirement where a certification body needs to track the expiration dates of the quality, environmental health, and safety certificates issued by other CBs to support the certification eligibility requirements, and in order to facilitate the issuance of major NCRs, the suspension of the R2 certificate in instances where the certificates lapse. Typically, our process up until now has related to sampling and confirming the validity of the certificates during the R2 audit each year. However, if a certificate is set to expire halfway between this year's audit and next year's audit, we're not looking at it until the next audit, potentially, several months worth of time that your R2 certificate is valid when your QEHS certificates have lapsed, and that is a problem. So, as I mentioned, there's a new requirement for CBs to be tracking the expiration dates. This will be updated in PJR's terms and conditions as we roll out this requirement ahead of the implementation deadline as well. If you are recertifying or getting a new certificate for those prerequisite certificates, it's really helpful to proactively send those copies to the certification body so that we can update our tracking. You'll certainly be hearing from PJR if your cert is expiring or has recently expired and we don't have updated copies or expiration details, so that we can make a decision about whether we need to suspend or whether we just need to swap the old copies for the new copies that you've obtained to show that those have been maintained in good standing. Again, the implementation deadline for these new requirements is May 18th. So we haven't implemented some of these requirements yet. It goes on to say in section 16.1 of the Code of Practices that the prerequisite certificates found to have been suspended, found to have expired, found to be unaccredited or have lost their accreditation, or have been revoked or withdrawn are subject to R2 suspension. It's important to remember that the maximum duration of suspension for the R2 certificate is 6 months. If we're not able to reinstate a suspended R2 certificate within 6 months of the suspension, it will need to be withdrawn. And this is stipulated by the Code of Practice and 17021 as well. So if you are, for whatever reason, not keeping up with your ISO audits and they lapse, the sooner you can get that audit scheduled and completed to get a certificate back in good standing, the better. Conversely, if your certification body holding your ISO or RIOS certs were to lose accreditation, hopefully they would be notifying you in a timely manner, but you'll need to work quickly to resolve that in order to be able to resolve the matter in its entirety within 6 months. And we can, provide assistance or clarification of those requirements if you find yourself in such a situation. There are instances where we have R2 facilities that are only brokering R2 controlled streams. And within the brokering category, we have R2 facilities that broker certain types of material streams while receiving and processing other types. So they wouldn't only have Appendix F, they might have Appendix B or C or E, because certain types of equipment are brokered and certain types are received and processed. Or the other type of broker situation is a no facility broker or a broker only facility where there is absolutely no processing taking place, meaning they're only looking at appendices A and F, and no R2 controlled streams or equipment components are ever received at the location. So if we're looking at the definition for a broker in the Code of Practice, we see really clearly that the brokers are sending those R2 controlled streams right from the upstream or the supplier directly to the downstream vendor for processing. They're not receiving those materials in-house. They're not sorting them or dismantling them in-house before sending it on to a downstream vendor. So we want to make sure that we are actually talking about a broker before we look closely at these. Brokers do not meet the R2 definition of brokering if they are coordinating functioning product, or, like I said, receiving it in-house to maybe sort it or aggregate it. That would be Appendix A. If they're receiving material and not processing it, but gathering it up and sending it to a downstream vendor, that would be considered Appendix A, not broker, not brokering under Appendix F. So assuming we're talking about true brokers, if they are a no facility broker or a broker only, they're not receiving or processing anything at their site, they could potentially be eligible for fully remote audits. So they're not receiving materials. We can potentially look at approving them for all virtual audits. And this is new in version 2.4 of the Code of Practices. Sections 4.1.6 and 5.5 address the changes on this slide, or it's where you can find the changes on this slide. There's some other rules with brokers. They can't be located at the same facility or in the same location as an electronics processor, which would be more of a shared facility scheme. And they also can't be located at the same site or location as their downstream vendor. They can't have an office set up in the same space that the downstream vendor is processing the material that's received. They really have to be separate. The criteria for conducting those fully virtual audits, if a broker only R2 facility is eligible for that requirement, are stipulated in the Code of Practice. There are additional criteria that would be placed on a client falling under that category to qualify to be eligible for those fully virtual audits, including dictating how audit time is calculated, maintaining a communication with Siri about clients falling into that category, adding to the audit duration at least 1 day of audit time. All of those things are included in 2.4. We don't have many broker-only R2 facilities at this time, and we are continuing to work to share Erie's definition of brokering to ensure that eligible clients are receiving Appendix F, and facilities that don't truly qualify for Appendix F are not keeping that brokering verbiage in their scope. That is an ongoing effort. Moving on to the next change, shared facility schemes. We have some changes in Table 3, the certification structure table in the Code of Practices. Shared facility schemes are no longer required to prove a parent relationship. It's also not contingent on whether the organizations located at what is being considered for a shared facility have the same ownership. To word that differently, it used to stipulate in Table 3 that they had to have different ownership to qualify for a shared facility. However, reference to ownership has been removed or revised, so that's no longer a contingency. Common parent schemes, the definition or the description of a common parent scheme has not been revised, but Section 5.3.2 of the Code of Practices does now require audit time be calculated in a different manner for common parent schemes, specifically the addition of a quarter day of audit time for each additional entity or organization beyond the parent company. So if we're looking at a 2-entity common parent scheme, then we would be adding a quarter day to the audit duration stipulated in the Code of Practices. If there are 3, then we would be adding a half day because there would be 2 entities in addition to the parent company. I'm hoping those examples help explain that one a little bit better. But certainly if you're unsure whether that applies to you, it's something that we could discuss in more detail. Sections 7.6.6 and 7.6.7 in the revised Code of Practice speak to the potential for approval to be granted for virtual audits beyond that which is allowed in 7.6.1 and what was allowed in version 2.3 of the Code of Practices. There's a list in the COP of what types of audits are allowed to be virtual. And if you've reviewed that list at all, you know that that is limited to 1 surveillance audit per cycle, per 3-year cycle, if the client is a good candidate and meets all of the requirements in the Code of Practices. But there could be, as this section alludes to, a situation where a second annual surveillance or even a recertification audit perhaps has some extreme conditions, such as significant safety concerns, maybe a do not travel restriction, or a significant resurgence of a pandemic, that would allow or prompt SERI to consider approving additional virtual audits. So this is something that would need to be submitted in writing for SERI to review by the certification body, and approval would need to be issued by SERI before we could conduct an audit virtually. That is currently not allowed under 7.6.1. I think these will be rare and they'll be under a high level of scrutiny. Perhaps the audit will be witnessed by SERI, for example. The next bullet point is covered under section 7.9.2 in COP version 2.4. During an integrated audit, the QEHS standards and the R2 standard, any NCR that's identified by the auditor that could be written under the QEHS standard or the R2 standard, because there's some overlap. This verbiage in the Code of Practice is explicitly requiring that the NCR be written against the R2 standard. So again, if there's an NCR that could be written under, say, ISO 9001 or R2, the Code of Practice is requiring us to write it under R2. As a reminder, the Code of Practice also requires virtual or on-site revisits for those NCRs. The final bullet point relates to section 7.9.3 in version 2.4 of the COP. Open internal audit findings do not preclude the R2 auditor from capturing the issues as NCRs during certification or recertification audits. And what that means is we are required to capture them. So if you have an internal audit that's been conducted recently and you identified a specific issue as a finding during the internal audit, but it isn't closed yet, the auditor, the R2 auditor, would likely still be writing that as an NCR since it hasn't been closed. And we want to follow that audit trail and ensure that it is closed. This is not required with surveillance audits, so it relates to the CB's ability to make a certificate decision, those certification and recertification audits being specifically called out in section 7.9.3. It goes on to specify that it wouldn't be sufficient to meet that requirement to write one grouped finding against the internal audit process, but rather each instance, each issue identified by the auditor would get its own NCR. Again, this facilitates the follow-up, the continuation of that audit trail to see what types of corrective actions are used to close those internal audit findings. The Code of Practice stipulates which conditions must be identified as major NCRs. This section, this requirement, isn't new. However, there are some additional items that have been added to this list in version 2.4 of the COP. And in version 2.4, this can be found in section 7.9.5. So I'm not including the whole list on this slide. I'm including what has been added to the pre-existing list. Those additions are not registering and or updating the registration of downstream vendors within the recycling chain with SERI if that registration is how the R2 facility chose to demonstrate transparency conformity under Appendix A 4B. So this wouldn't apply if clients or R2 facilities are meeting the transparency requirements under a different option. But if they chose the registration option and they fail to register or maintain the registration as current, that would be a major NCR during PJR's audit. Another item on the list is inadequate scoping of quality environmental health and safety certificates. We previously went through this in this webinar. Another is lack of identification or implementation of applicable legal and regulatory requirements. So you can get a major NCR for having those compliance issues. Failure to report a violation to the certification body within 30 days of receipt. This requirement is found in core requirement 4D5. So if we show up to our audit and we find a violation to maybe a wastewater permit or a stormwater permit or an OSHA inspection violation that are 2 or 3 months old and no evidence can be produced that the certification body was notified of the violation, a major NCR would be issued. And the last addition on this slide is not providing or maintaining the requested documents and records that are required to demonstrate conformity to the standard. And this is found in core requirement 3C. We're not talking here about one document that couldn't be produced. This is a more systemic issue, a host of documents or records, a lack of transparency, a lack of cooperation, a lack of timely, the ability to produce those documents in a timely manner. So this would be more systemic in nature. It would not be the intention that a major NCR is issued for one document or record that couldn't be produced. Moving on to section 7.9.6 in the revised Code of Practices. The maximum duration between stage 1 and stage 2 audits has been removed. Previously, this was stipulated as no more than 6 months between a stage 1 and a stage 2. Version 2.4 of the COP attempts or approaches, I should say, this concept in a different manner. Instead of placing a maximum duration between those two audits, a deadline is given for the final certificate to be issued within 8 months of the completion of the stage 1. This is a very different approach to try to limit how long it might take for an initial certification to be issued. We want to avoid a situation where the stage 2 is completed, the NCRs drag out a long time, and then the technical review process of the package isn't assigned in a timely manner. And lo and behold, the certificate is finally issued just before their first annual surveillance audit. So the deadline now is to issue a certificate within 8 months of the stage 1 audit's completion. If a stage 1 audit is not successful and a repeat stage 1 audit is conducted, the deadline, the 8-month deadline, would begin at the end of the repeat stage 1. That would essentially restart the clock. So rather than conducting a very lengthy revisit, which is almost the same duration of the stage 1, we could potentially utilize repeat stage 1s instead. Found in table 6, we have revisions and a restructuring of the deadlines to close the various types of NCRs or the various audit types. There are a host of different deadlines housed in table 6. It's been reformatted into a table rather than a bulleted text approach in 2.3. So some of the deadlines have changed, and certainly the format of those deadlines in the Code of Practice has changed. Table 6 also includes spelling out the ramifications for not meeting the deadlines. So one such example is the deadline to issue a certificate within 8 months of the stage 1. If that deadline's not met, a repeat audit is required, and that's spelled out in table 6. If correction plans, correction responses, and evidence of correction implementation for an NCR from, say, a surveillance audit can't be produced within the 60 days that are detailed in table 6, then the certificate is suspended. So the deadlines and the ramifications for not meeting the deadlines are now found in table 6 in version 2.4 of the COP. Moving right along, some other additional verbiage in 2.4. Our auditors will be required to sample and note in their reports all the sales websites utilized by an R2 facility. If you're selling on multiple platforms or multiple sites under different seller names, This was always subject to sampling. This was always fair game. Now we need to really, really clearly call it out in our audit packages. So as an R2 facility, you can be prepared for your audits by having these ready to go or being ready to disclose all of the sales websites utilized for used electronic components that are subject to R2 certification. Core requirement 4 has been added to the annual audit sampling requirements, meaning at every single surveillance audit, we will also be sampling core requirement 4, legal and other requirements, whereas previously we covered it at least once between the 2 surveillance audit cycles. Similarly, there's a change regarding core requirement 10, but this one relates only to brokers, to clients certified to Appendix F. If you are certified to Appendix F brokering, core requirement 10 becomes an annual audit sampling requirement as well, so that we can sample more thoroughly or more diligently the transport requirements in core 10. Those changes are found in Table 7 and Section 8.1.3 of version 2.4 of the COP. Under Section 7.12.7, we also find a requirement that relates to the potential for post-audit NCRs. And this is referring to the concept that the technical package review could identify nonconformities that the auditor overlooked. We're not doing a second audit during the technical package review process, but if you look at the Code of Practices, there are a lot of items that the technical package review is required to confirm. Sometimes through that confirmation process, overlooked NCRs can be identified, or the auditor accepted something that was not entirely sufficient and shouldn't have been accepted, and a post-audit NCR may be warranted. The Code of Practice revision in this area stipulates that we're not able to just capture those concerns to be verified during the next audit. Post-audit NCRs would need to be revised, would need to be addressed and closed before the technical package review could be approved, rather than waiting until the next audit to attempt to dig into those issues further. The first bullet point relates to Section 8.1.1, which you might recall is the section where we are given an extension to the implementation deadline. The annual audits are now due within 12 months of the certification decision, the stage 2 or the recertification certificate decisions. And you can kind of think of it as an annual anniversary. 12 months from that date every year, every following year is when the audit is due. So we'll be able to theoretically schedule these audits further in advance or identify that deadline really clearly in order to spread our auditor resources out throughout the year. This eliminates the concept of a bottleneck at the end of the calendar year, when anyone who hasn't had their audit and needs one by the end of the year is scrambling to be scheduled, and there are only so many days in the month of December. There is verbiage about extensions potentially being granted by SERI if the CB is having some scheduling constraints. So perhaps we have a high number of clients due in December, not waiting until December, but truly due in December. and there is an issue of inclement weather, and we're unable to meet that deadline, we can appeal, we can request an extension for SERI to consider. It may or may not be granted, but in those rare instances where the CB is having a scheduling constraint to meet that 12-month deadline, an extension can be requested by the certification body. This wouldn't apply in instances where the client facility doesn't return their annual paperwork for the audit duration to be calculated, and thus their audit isn't scheduled by the deadline. So failure on the client's part to schedule the audits to be conducted by that annual deadline, according to the Code of Practices, will result in suspension. And as we've already discussed, suspension can potentially lead to withdrawal of certification if it's not resolved by the stipulated deadlines. So this is something that for existing clients, we have until January of next year to get our arms around. We can implement it sooner, certainly. And for new clients, we will be required to meet this requirement from the get-go. But for existing clients, we do have until January 1st to get everyone on an adjusted schedule. Stay tuned for more updates on that. Significant changes, according to the second bullet point, warrant on-site verification in many instances. So significant changes can prevent the approval of an audit to be conducted virtually. It goes on to speak to section 8.2.2 in version 2.4 of the COP. This is related to virtual audit eligibility criteria. There were some sections, or rather requirements, from 2.3 that were removed in 2.4, which results in fewer documented evidence or fewer documents that need to be verified for a virtual audit approval to be granted. So PJR's virtual approval process relies on an F108 ICT form to be populated by the client and submitted for review, so that we have an individual justification for every audit that's being approved or not approved to go virtually. This is PJR's process, and the F108 ICT R2 form has already been revised to remove the previous requirements that were taken out of the Code of Practices. So rather than continue to ask our clients about documents that won't be relevant to the virtual approval process, those questions have been removed from the form already. Excuse me. Fully remote audits are granted, the approval is granted on an audit by audit basis, as I mentioned on the last slide. Section 8.4, excuse me, of the revised Code of Practices requires that all of the audit packages for R2 audits that are conducted fully remote or entirely virtually be uploaded to SERI's file sharing system. Previously, packages were only uploaded upon SERI request, and this is covered by the Code of Practices and the SERI CB license agreement criteria that packages requested by SERI are required to be shared, and this is part of SERI's oversight as well, their assurance program. It's covered in the Code of Practices. But again, previously, packages were requested individually to be uploaded to the file sharing system for SERI to sample. Now this verbiage indicates that all of the fully remote R2 audit packages need to be uploaded automatically. So this means that the likelihood of SERI sampling the fully remote R2 audit packages is high. I don't anticipate that that will impact our clients' desire to have at least one surveillance audit virtually per cycle if they're a good virtual candidate. I don't anticipate that to cause a significant shift, but I did want to make our clients aware of that change if they weren't already aware that Siri was able to sample any audit package they want. All of those fully remote R2 packages will automatically need to be uploaded to Siri. Section 8.6.2 in the revised Code of Practices mentions specifically transfer clients. So there was already a requirement in this section to assign a new auditor, a new lead auditor at a recertification audit if the previous audit cycle, the previous 3 audits, were all conducted by the same lead auditor. So that requirement was already found in the Code of Practices, but now it's calling out specifically, hey, don't forget about transfer clients. If a client is transferring mid-cycle or right ahead of their recertification audit, whatever the case may be, we need to understand which auditors audited that client in the certification cycle in case that particular auditor works for various CBs to ensure that we can meet that requirement and assign a new lead auditor come recert time if necessary. All right, we're down to our last couple slides. I know we're a little bit over the hour mark. Bear with me, please, while we wrap this up. Section 9.1 in version 2.4 of the COP indicates that Siri will formally review and approve all R2v3 certificates. So Siri is ultimately the one making the final decision, and certificates up until Siri approves them are considered draft certificates. We're already providing a copy of the certificates to Siri, but this structure, this dynamic is shifting. Siri will be performing a formal review and approval of the certificates. After Siri has approved the certificate, copies of the certificate can be provided to the R2 facility by the certification body. And those approved certificates will be used to update not only the Siri directory, the Siri database of certified R2 facilities, but also the IAF cert search. Any rejected certificates would obviously require resolution before they can be approved. This may be something that the CB needs to contact the client about or work with the client to resolve. Was there a discrepancy in the name? Was there a typo in the address? Should there perhaps have been a different scheme selected that would have been a better fit? There's a whole host of items that could fall under this category and result in a rejected certificate. Although our audit process and our technical review process are dedicated to eliminating as many of those possibilities as possible. It kind of goes hand in hand with this concept of the certificate review, but section 9.2.1 includes yet another reminder that any and all applicable DBAs and entity names are required to be registered and designated on the R2 and QEHS prerequisite certificates so that they are in agreement with one another. This would not relate to DBAs or entity names that are not doing R2 certifiable activities, but it would stipulate that all applicable names are registered and included. We don't get to pick and choose if they're being used interchangeably or they're overlapping with R2 certifiable work, scopes of work. They do need to be included. And that is not a new requirement, but the verbiage in section 9.2.1 is revised or is new, and it's mentioned in a number of places throughout the Code of Practices, as well as in Core 1 of the standard itself. Last key change slide. Verification of changes must be conducted via an audit within 60 days of the effective date of the change to avoid suspension. We did go through this right at the beginning of the webinar, excuse me. I think it was the first slide about key changes. However, I'm covering it again for two reasons. One, it's also in a section at the end of the Code of Practices. In section 13, there's a different subsection allocated to each of the three categories of changes that Siri is referring to here. So it's covered again at the end of the Code of Practices in section 13. I'm also covering it again because it's really significant and it's the kind of one of the points I want to end the webinar on. 60 days from the effective date of the change is the deadline to have the verification audit. So going back to what we discussed before, the effective date of the change is the date that the name was registered or that the full scope of processing of electronics that's on the current R2 certificate is pared down or stopped to help facilitate moving the equipment and moving the inventory to the new location for a facility move. The effective date of the change doesn't necessarily mean the date that you realized you needed to notify Perry Johnson registrars of that change. We're going by the effective date of the change. So if you're not notifying the CB until 30 days later, now we're down to 30 days to get that audit conducted in order to avoid suspension of certification. And depending on how little notice we're provided, we may or may not be able to facilitate that deadline. We want to avoid suspension now that the Code of Practice allows that potential for facility moves. We certainly want to help our clients keep their certifications valid. So we need to be able to have those audits by the deadline. We need prompt communication of those changes from our clients. Feel free to share these changes in advance. We're going to be changing our name. This will be effective, 2 weeks from today. The prompt communication is really going to be key here. It also goes on to stipulate in section 13 that if the verification audit or the change audit is taking place at the same time as an annual audit, if the timing works out, or you just took the suspension so you had more time to get ready, whatever the case may be, if those audits are being combined, we are required to add time by the revised Code of Practices. That is not optional. We can't calculate the surveillance audit time and tack on a facility move without adding any audit duration. So something to keep in mind. And again, notifying us in a prompt and timely manner will help minimize the likelihood of a suspension of certification in the event of those changes, facility moves, name changes, and certification scheme or structure changes. The last two bullet points can be found in section 16.1. 5 or more major NCRs require suspension of the R2 cert. This is new to 2.4 as well. And this goes hand in hand with section 16.1, which indicates the suspension criteria. It also goes hand in hand with the section of the Code of Practice that dictates what needs to be a major NCR. So several criteria are identified that are automatically required to be captured as majors. And if you have 5 or more majors, 2.4 is requiring suspension. 5 or more major NCRs to Siri sends the message that the system is ineffective. The management system is not effective, and the certificate shouldn't be valid until that is improved. So 5 or more major NCRs under the R2 standard will automatically be required to result in suspension of the R2 certificate until those NCRs are closed. That means correction, corrective action, revisit, all of that stuff. And the final bullet point comes from section 16.1.7 in version 2.4 of the COP, and that is that the R2 certificate can be withdrawn or revoked if fraudulent activities are identified. Falsification of records, for example. Illegal imports or exports might be another example. Certainly not an all-inclusive list, but just trying to give you a couple examples off the top of my head. A couple of examples are listed in section 16.1.7 of the COP, if you're curious about what else might fall under that category. So if you haven't already, please take a moment to type your questions into the question field in the GoToWebinar panel. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. Perry Johnson appreciates not only your time, but your business. If you're one of our customers, one of our R2 clients or a prospective client, feel free to reach out to PJR about a quote, whether to pursue certification, or if you think adding R2 certification onto what certifications you already hold could be helpful. Happy to discuss that further with you. And I will also share my contact information. My email is amatthews@pjr.com. Again, my name is Austin Matthews, and I am the EHS Program Manager at PJR. I'm going to go ahead and see what questions we might have. No worries if you're still typing, take your time. Okay, so we have a question about scoping for the QEHS prerequisite certificates to meet R2 requirements. The question is whether all of the QEHS certificates are required to have the same scope. So if we think back to the slides in the webinar that touched on this subject, we covered it from a couple of different perspectives, but the main concepts are that we are not contradicting the contents of the R2 certificate, and that we're meeting any appendix specific requirements. So for example, Appendix C requires a QMS certification. So we'd be looking especially closely at the Quality Management Systems certificate, but R2 overall requires the EHS certificate. We have seen instances where the scopes are identical across the board, and we've also seen instances where they vary. Perhaps the QMS cert contains more specific verbiage that relates to Appendix C, which requires the QMS certification, and the EHS certificates are less specific in that area, still speaking to the recycling or the processing of used electronics, but perhaps not calling out the testing and repair process using the same verbiage. We have a number of clients that have identical scope statements so that there's less concern that something is overlooked. They all match. It seems to be easier for some of our clients, but identical scope statements isn't specifically the requirement of the standard. We need to make sure that we are not contradicting the contents of the R2 certificate, that we're meeting those appendix specific criteria, Appendix C, Appendix F, just a few examples. The requirement isn't necessarily that they are identical. They could differ if they still meet the requirements. I hope that helps answer your question. Thank you for your question. It looks like that is the only question, although I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes and see if anyone is perhaps still typing. Otherwise, thank you again for joining us today. We will be hosting the same webinar one more time before the implementation deadline, or right around the implementation deadline. I'll provide an update to the contents of the slides if anything changes, but I hope covering the key changes in the Code of Practices is helpful, and feel free to contact me at amatthews@pjr.com if you have more technical questions that would be better suited to a discussion offline. I hope you have a wonderful day and good luck implementing the requirements of the revised COP.